And kind of the more you do this, it's kind of hazy. You have a good place to start. So you're kind of driving this fog, and then a tire popped. Okay, got to do that. But how else would you have known that the tire was ready to pop, and unless you kept driving? And then you drive, then it gets a little bit clearer, and then you know that you have to veer slightly to the right. And it's kind of this process of you keep going, you keep getting more info if you're intentional about it, and then it's kind of this like feed forward loop of becoming better at doing sports science because it's a skill. Welcome to the Talking Shop podcast, where I'm here to share stories, lessons, and experiences in sports performance and professional development. I'm your host, Matt Tometz, and today I'm joined by myself for a solo 3 sports science foundations for understanding and integration into your program. So let's get into it. My experience. So first off, what qualifies me to talk about sports science? Currently, I'm a performance coach at TSP Sports Performance. We have a lot of technology here, data-driven speed development, working with my coworkers to help integrate sports science principles and things like that into our planning and performing of training. I was a sports scientist at TCU for 2 years. I did my thesis with the women's beach volleyball team. I'm almost published, knock on wood, in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research for my thesis, doing load monitoring for them. I worked a year for the women's tennis team as well, just helping out with their technology. So I have about 2 years of experience, plus this kind of coaching, strength and conditioning background. So I like to kind of put it all together. So themes, the main themes that are going to be across this whole podcast is context and action, right? And one very simple quote or question that I think sums up this very well is, how do we create more context for the numbers we're collecting? And how do we use those numbers to drive action, right? So I'll get into this obviously, but context, right? The numbers mean something. It's not just the numbers itself. And action, right? We're collecting data for a purpose, to become better practitioners, to help us do our job better, to help increase the odds of winning, to help reduce the risk of injury and things like that. So if we're not driving action through our sports science, we're just collecting numbers just to look at numbers, then what's the point? Now, of course, when you collect numbers, it doesn't mean that every little thing has to result in an action. But I would assume or hope that eventually, or sometimes more often than not, you're actually on track with your numbers, or they are what they should be, which I'll get into. But if no change is going to happen, right? Because no one's perfect. The sports science is helping us make better decisions. So that's the context of this podcast. All right, I'm super excited for this. I've had this idea for a a PowerPoint slide for I don't even know how long. But so on the screen, 500 AU, 500 arbitrary units. SRPE load, so session rating of perceived exertion, 1 out of 10, how hard do you think the session was, times time in minutes. So SRPE 1 through 10 times minutes. SRPE load is 500 arbitrary units. We are in week 3 of season, T-2 until our next game. This was the number for an athlete that is usually lower than team average. And every bit of information I'm clicking for my listeners on the podcast, not on YouTube. So 500 arbitrary units, that's SRPE load, week 3 of season, T-2 until a game, and is from an athlete that's usually lower than team average. And the planned SRPE load is 275 arbitrary units. Okay, so the plan was 275, player lower than team average. They had 500, and it's relatively close to game time. Next, I have a bar graph of planned and actual training loads. So this is all just made up data, but we have weeks 1 through 5. In the blue, the planned training load, 300 arbitrary units, 400, 500, 600, down to 450 for week 5. And we have the actual 350, 525, 600, 575, 575. So just comparing contrasting visually from planned to actual. So concept number 1, plan. It doesn't matter what the number is. The number itself doesn't mean anything. It matters what the number is relative to what it's supposed to be, aka what is it relative to the plan or what you thought it was going to be. And this was some of the biggest successes that I found as a sports scientist in the variety of settings that I've been integrating and guiding, helping sports science is, for example, a coach SRPE, or basically the coach's plan. So we'll just use SRPE as an example. So we know that we're going to ask the players 1 out of 10 how hard they thought the session was. It's the coach's job before the session starts, what they think the athletes are going to put or what they think the team average is going to be. Or not even getting that granular, just saying, you have volume and intensity, right? You have distance and then you have heart rate load. Let's say you have GPS and heart monitors. Can you put each day, the variables for each day for distance and heart rate, can you put a high or medium or low day? And then you get the numbers and then you put them in different categories and then you see, all right, I thought distance was going to go low, medium, high, low. Well, it went medium, 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 high, medium, for example. So concept number 1, just to reiterate, it doesn't matter what the number is. It matters what the number is relative to what it's supposed to be. Concept number 2, observe. So each system will be unique. Each coaching staff, set of athletes, sport program within that sport is going to have its own challenges, its own successes, its own interpretation of the numbers in sports science. Each sports scientist is going to explain numbers, and data collection and analysis and all of that differently, which is going to then influence people's understanding of it. So just understanding and respecting that each system will be unique, and what worked for one program might not necessarily work for the other. One athlete's understanding won't necessarily be the understanding of another athlete, and just this idea, not necessarily individuality, but just like it's not the same across the board. Some athletes will run high, some athletes will run low on certain numbers, not actual running. Some will be very consistent with their numbers, and then I'll get into examples later on this slide. And kinks in your system will come up. Everything is new. You can't know everything all at once. That'd be pretty cool if you could. But more kinks will come up over time, but the big kinks will immediately surface. So there's things in the variety of sports science initiatives that I have helped bring out, implement in team settings. There's things that you just won't know that will happen. There's things that you couldn't predict, little light bulb moments that you literally would not have realized or thought of otherwise unless you actually went and did it. So here's just some examples. I'm using subjective numbers, not necessarily that there's only issues or only need for observation periods for subjective numbers. This is just an example. But you have Likert scale stuff. So this will be like athlete daily wellness questionnaires, sleep quality, energy, soreness, stress, stuff like that. So usually Likert scale 1 through 7, 4 being in the middle, 1 low, 7 high. So there's a variety of different things, right? It's a 1 through 7 scale, but most athletes view 1 as being an extreme and 7 as also being an extreme. So 1 through 7 scale is really like a 2 through 5, right? There's some athletes that will be, they just always will put a low energy because they fill it out relatively earlier in the morning. They'll usually never go above a 4, anywhere from 2, 3, or 4. That's their usual number. You have athletes that crush their sleep every night, and they always feel like they should have some amount of energy, right? They're a 4, 5, or 6. And then you have some athletes that, is it intentional? Is it them being lazy? Is it actually 4 all the time? But they'll just put 4 all the time because that's the middle. That's the average. There can be issues with, not issues, kinks. I feel like kinks is less of a intense word than issue. In administering this stuff in a team setting, And this is what I found in multiple situations when athletes are in charge of filling out these sports science questionnaires in a team setting. They tend to congregate and talk about, what are you going to put? What do you think? XYZ. If everyone thought the practice was a 5, you don't want to put a 9 because then it looks, kind of bad on you. And right, wrong, or the other, I'm not trying to talk bad about any situation. This is just the point of observing. The word I almost just said is, these are just observations that I made. So then, how could I have ever, without having actually done this before, anticipated my athletes kind of getting together and talking about their sports science numbers? I don't know. If you have a reason why I should have done that, then let me know. But then after this observation period, then I can address that. Hey guys, I'm asking you because I want to know what you put. I want to know how you are feeling. I want to know how you interpreted that practice, et cetera, et cetera. So those are just some examples of the importance of an observation period. And then we can go into even some external load measures or some objective numbers. I forgot. I don't know the study off the top of my head. Don't ask me. But something about GPS data. I believe there was some study or someone mentioned it. Don't quote me. That GPS data for a team should be collected for at least 4 years before any decisions or real conclusions can be made. Now, in this applied sports science setting, something where you're with the team every day, it's not for strict research. I don't think you have 4 years to wait. But do I think you have, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks to where you can be more casual about making decisions? I would say so, but that's just an example. Or an athlete who, an athlete could run high or low on the objective or the subjective numbers, just all things to keep in mind. Concept number 3, act. Now, although this is concept number 3, the 3 concepts kind of go more in a cycle like this than kind of 1, 2, 3. And I'll get there. Don't worry. I know you're worried. So first, or initially, determine what actions/changes you're willing to make, and also what you're willing to ask of your athletes. So first, what actions you're willing to make. Now, this isn't that you're supposed to have everything sorted out from the beginning. Like I said, in sports science, things will come up over time that you just wouldn't have known otherwise. So for example, we'll just use athlete wellness questionnaires. You get info on their sleep and how sore they are, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you're going to get data on how the athletes are sleeping, and let's say they're not getting enough sleep, are you willing to have that conversation with that athlete? Are you willing to work with them on going to a team tutor to then get more on top of their stuff, then to consequently get more sleep? Or is that one of those things, personal, don't ask, don't tell, whatever, that's just, you trust them to figure out their own stuff? Well, not that you always have to act on the data, but if you're not willing to ever or at all, then, or consequently, an example of this is, are you willing to take away morning practice or morning weights because you know that they're not getting enough sleep? So that's just, what are you willing to make? If, like I said earlier, if it's not driving action eventually, if it's not driving action purposefully, right? Acting just to act is kind of pointless. Then you're just collecting numbers just to collect numbers, just because it sounds cool or looks cool. That's not a good use of you or your athlete's time. Second, what you're willing to ask of your athletes. With the SRPE wellness questionnaires, one reason why we elected to do that, the teams that I worked with, is because it's intended to be done in a minute or less. How much sleep did you get? Sleep quality, energy, soreness, stress, and then every session, how long was it, which they should know, and what they thought the SRP was. That's 7 questions that are just type in the answer or slide a little scale thing, Or are you willing to have athletes come in early, I don't know, let's say a urine specific gravity test, let's say a vertical jump test protocol on force plates. What are you willing to ask of them to do? And of course, with every sector, private, college, pro, there's going to be different limitations, things that work to your advantage, et cetera, et cetera. But what are you willing to ask of them? And then also so this idea of creating action, driving action, what does the frequency of data review / decision making look like? Some people think that they want the daily numbers, they want to know what it is every session, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're not going to change the weekly practice schedule or the weekly schedule of the days, you just want to review it. Team meeting Monday morning, you'll plan the week, you do your week, and then you're not willing to change that once you make it. Well, then why do you need the numbers every day? That's just more stress on the sports scientist. Not that that's a bad thing, but if you want to maximize their time and effort, then that's just more time wasted for you looking at the daily numbers. And then it's just not efficient. So if you're only going to make weekly changes, then only look at weekly numbers, or look at the daily numbers, but only look at them on a weekly basis. Let me rephrase that. But if you're willing to look at the numbers that night of the day before to help influence the decisions made for the next day, then obviously look at it daily. And this isn't to say that you have to have this all sorted out. Like I said, similar with the observe, you could start out with daily reports, and then you realize that honestly, I don't really look at them every day. They kind of just get to the bottom of my inbox, and then you can say, hey, just present it to me at the weekly meeting. Or you start out with a more conservative approach of weekly, and you're like, I really want to know how it was today. Like after the session, I want to know how it looked. Then you can go from there. And then similar to what actions you're willing to make, cut practice, cut weights, have more recovery, so these aren't specific examples. And in sports science, it's often taking stuff out. People often tend to do more. But a simple way to phrase this is, if you want more of X, you have to have less of Y. You can't have more training load, more time in the weight room, more time on the court, field, whatever, without having more recovery or less of one of those things, or less sleep, which is going to show up on the wellness questionnaires. So it's how are you willing to mess around with all these variables? If you want more of X, you have to have less of Y. Or if you have a really good plan, then it should be how it is, So that's concept number 3 is ACT. And man, I love these. I think it's called Smart Art, whatever, in PowerPoint. So it's all relative to the plan. So it all starts with the plan. And then this observe and act kind of go back and forth. And then depending on what your observations are telling you, then that knows what decisions you should make. And then as you learn more in this process of going act, observe, then it should help you make a better plan eventually, and let's say first few weeks, your plan relative to what actually happened is just absolute garbage. It's a skill. Everything's a skill. I've said this in different topic podcasts, but everything's a skill. Like your ability to predict what your athletes are going to respond, your ability to intentionally schedule a practice and educatedly guess what it's going to be. That's a skill, and you'll get better at it over time. So kind of, if you have this intentional cycling process, plan, observe, act, that changes how I observe. And then based on what I was observing, okay, I'm going to plan it a little bit differently. Hopefully over time, you can get this pretty consistent, I guess, or I guess we'll use a sports science term because it's a sports science podcast, reliable. Hopefully your reliability will increase over time the more you do this. And concept number 3.5. And as I was thinking my way through this podcast, what I want to be on my PowerPoint and just the script, I was like, what are things that I say a lot when I talk about sports science, when I had these conversations first with coaches and uh, just different staff members. Well, or really, what do I believe in? And it was, okay, well, it's all relative to the plan. The numbers itself doesn't mean anything. Well, there definitely has to be somewhat of an observation period to get kind of a grasp on implementing integrating sports science. But then it has to drive action. Like there has to be a point to it eventually. And kind of the more you do this, it's kind of hazy. You have a good place to start. You're in the car and you want to go XYZ, and then that made no sense, but bear with me. So you're kind of driving this fog, and then oh, a tire popped. Okay, got to do that. But how else would you have known that the tire was ready to pop, and unless you kept driving? And then you drive, then it gets a little bit clearer, and then you know that you have to veer slightly to the right. And it's kind of this process of you keep going, you keep getting more info if you're intentional about it, and then it's kind of this like feed forward loop of becoming better at doing sports science because it's a skill. And concept 3.5, something that I've been saying a lot is this really just the scientific method? And I don't know if this is my scientific box brain of like, this is the flow and this is how it goes, because that makes the most sense. But, you have the scientific method of you have your hypothesis, you collect your data / experiment, you analyze it, and then, you make a conclusion, right? Hypothesis, data, conclusion. Well, what are my three concepts? Plan, observe, act. Hypothesis, plan, data, observe, conclusion, act. Now that wasn't intentional, but it's pretty cool when it works out like that. So just another way of phrasing, like the scientific method is the scientific method for a reason, because it follows this logical flow of science, right? Sports science. How do we apply the principles of science to sport? Action steps. Let's finish it up. So plan. First, you got to plan what numbers you're going to collect and plan out what you think they should be. It can be super specific. If it's an SRPE, what do you think the team average is going to be? Now, I'm not asking you to predict how many meters the team average is going to be running, because that's 3,000, right? But I think high, medium, low is not too crazy to ask for. So some consistent way that makes sense to you, that you think will be reliable enough to plan / guess / predict what do you think the numbers are going to be. So pre-act. So this is how I said it's more of like a continuous cycle. So pre-act, what changes you're willing to make, and then also what you're going to ask of your athletes and the frequency of those things. If you're willing to ask a lot of those athletes, then it might not be a daily thing. It might be a weekly thing, or if it's short, sweet, to the point, maybe it can be a daily thing. And what changes are you willing to make as a professional? So your changes, ask of your athletes, frequency of all of that is kind of in this pre-act category. And then you have actually observing. So being unbiased. And this is one thing that I found myself guilty of, at least in my head, is, are the numbers high because they actually were, or are the numbers high because you wanted them to be high, or because the plan was for the numbers to be high, or vice versa, low, whatever it may be? Or are you kind of skeptical of the numbers because they didn't turn out how you wanted them to be? Well, the numbers are the numbers for a reason, and you're collecting them because you don't want to guess. So like I said, collecting numbers, analyzing numbers, being unbiased about numbers, this is all a skill. But observe, be unbiased. So in this first main observation period, only act on huge red flags until you have enough-ish data that's collected. And I'm not going to put a hard number blanket statement, but if you're, let's say, college again, for the first semester is 15 weeks. Well, can you be casual about the decisions you're making in 3 or 4 weeks? I think that that's a reasonable amount of time. You have 1 week, everyone's getting their bearings. Week 2, you have a vague idea of not even a trend, but just you can start comparing, contrasting. I'll put it that way. Week 3, okay, you can have that high, medium, low, see how it goes. 4 weeks, everyone should be somewhat familiar. So if I had to put a vague, non-prescriptive statement on how long an observation period should be, I would say 3 or 4 weeks-ish context, right? Now, if you're doing stuff for an NFL combine, well, if the thing goes for 6 to 8 weeks, I don't know if you can just observe for 50% of it, et cetera, et cetera. Or let's say you're training for a quadrennial, you're an Olympic athlete, sports scientist, right? Well, you're kind of playing the long game, doing some mental math, put myself in the spot, 12 times 4, 48. Well, what's 1/48th of all of your sports science? Probably not that much. Maybe you could do 2, 3 months. So it's all relative, right? Context to your observation period. How long are you doing it for? And then act accordingly. And hopefully this flow of action steps kind of makes sense where you have your plan, you pre-act, how do I think this is all going to go down in my actions, right? You observe, kinks come up, red flags come up, and then you just act accordingly. And then it's this cycle feedback loop: plan, observe, act, go back to observing. Okay, that influences how I plan things to be. So, like I said, this is all grounded in the scientific method. So, that is the end of my podcast. Don't want to start repeating myself any more than I already do, but I hope that makes sense. Kind of just the more that I do this, the more that I communicate my sports science thoughts and beliefs with you, with my colleagues, with other professionals, trying to find succinct ways to describe it that makes sense, but also somewhat tie in these nuances. And that's why you have a longer form podcast. And now I'm kind of ranting. So hopefully that makes sense. Please reach out if it does, if it helped. If it didn't, I can only get better with your feedback, and that can only start with me asking for it. So thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to the next podcast, and sports science on.